I think we're going to start now. Let it. Okay. Okay, Perry. Yeah. Well, first of all, I'd like to begin by welcoming all of you on behalf of the Hudson Institute to this event, which is dedicated to a discussion of recent events in U.S. Russian relations and an evaluation, to the extent that it's possible, of the reset policy of the Obama administration. Obviously, Russia has been very much in the news in recent weeks, so there are many subjects that we both want and need to cover. And to do so, we have really two of the most outstanding analysts of the Russian situation with us. Andrei Piontkovsky, who is a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute, presently living in Moscow and writing widely for the Russian media, a member of the Coordinating Council of the Opposition, and a leading theorist and strategist. One of the few people in Russia who is seeking to look beyond simply opposition to Putin and trying to develop a conception for Russia's future. We also have Andrei Ilarionov, who is a senior fellow at the Cato Institute, also a prolific writer and outstanding figure in the Democratic opposition. He was the chief, or one of the chief economic advisors to Putin during the early years of Putin's presidency, his first term, before breaking with Putin and going into opposition. The third person will be me. I'm David Satter. I'm a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute and former Moscow correspondent, and as some of you may know, longtime observer of Russia and the Soviet Union. I'm going to ask Andrei Piontkovsky to begin. I will speak after Andrei has finished his remarks, and Andrei Ilarionov will conclude. We are going to try to keep our remarks relatively short, relatively brief, because I'm sure that many of you have questions and we have many things to discuss. So we'll leave ample time for the question period. Well, once again, thanks for coming, and I'm going to turn the lectern over to my good friend and outstanding analyst of Russia, Andrei Piontkovsky.
Thank you, David, for very generous introduction. I would make only one clarification. I already not member of coordinated committee. I left it a couple of weeks ago because I consider it not radical enough in its opposition to Putin.
I actually remember that, and that slipped my mind. But in any case,
well, how much time we have?
I think we should each speak for about 20 minutes to allow a maximum amount of time for questions from the audience.
Well, my presentation will have two parts. First, I think I plan to discuss the general philosophy of resetting. Its genesis, its failure, and its future.
Andrei, speak into the microphone we're having.
Sorry, it's okay?
All right.
Okay. And in the second part, I illustrate this consideration by events of recent day and even of today, because today I tell you later why it's an important day in the history of Russia. Well, the term resetting was designed by former State Secretary Madam Hillary Clinton. And you remember this embarrassing situation at the meeting with Lavrov when she presented him the button symbolizing setting, and in Russian the inscription was перезагрузка, not перегрузка. So overloading. And this symbolism proved to be prophetic. And the mere word, the resetting metaphor, it seems to me was very appropriate to Russian-American relationship. When we use resetting in computer, when you face some problem, the computer doesn't work, and we don't understand why it doesn't work, and we don't have any plan to improve situation. We just pushing the button in the hope that maybe the next time it will be work better. The Russian-American relationship were steadily deteriorating since 2001-2002. This was a peak of our cooperation in Afghanistan. In 2002, in Moscow summit, the document of strategic cooperation was signed. Well, steadily deteriorating until 2009. A new Obama administration decided to push this button of resetting. Frankly, there were some vague ideas behind this resetting. The architects of resetting, and there are a lot of architects of resetting, beginning from Barack Obama to our friend Mike McFaul, current ambassador in Moscow. Their reasoning was that, well, it seems that we don't understand something in Russian mentality, in their concern. We don't accommodate to their grievances, legitimate grievances. Let's try to be more nice to them, and maybe we restore a kind of strategic partnership. And the most visible classical grievances of Russian diplomacy for the latest 15 years were two. It's anti-ballistic missile program and expansion of NATO. But every serious analyst understands that these are, I would say, grievances of choice. It's not real grievances, because every military expert and nuclear expert understands that all American plans for the coming 15 years from now for the ABM system does not threaten the Russian nuclear deterrent, doesn't able to undermine the potential second strike capability of Russian nuclear forces. And expansion of NATO, well, NATO expanded really to the Russian borders, but to southern border, when it for several years, almost for 10 years, desperately tried to protect Russian southern belly. The real grievances of Russian political elite and Russian rulers were different, and there were deep psychological complexes. And first of them is complex of losing the status of superpower. Another former State Secretary, U.S. State Secretary Condoleezza Rice once said, I remember it was in 2007 or 2006, that Soviet and Russian-American relations have never been so good in the history as now. I answered then in one of the columns that they have never been so bad, because I remember well the Soviet times. And in Soviet times there was no so ferocious, virile, anti-American propaganda on state TVs 24/7 hours. This anti-Americanism in modern Russia, anti-Americans of elites, first of all, and anti-Americans of rule, is incomparable with Soviet anti-Americanism. Well, in Soviet times, the Soviet and Russian Soviet elite felt that they are in the Super League and the world politics. There are Super Leagues where there are only two teams, USSR and USA. And certainly Americans are rival, maybe enemies, but there was a kind of self-respect that, well, we are fighting in economic, political sphere with very powerful states, and we are equal in many terms. Today's anti-Americanism is driven by complex of inferiority, complex of loss of this status of superpower, and the only way to restore this status, to feel themselves on the equal with the United States, is to confront United States, to denounce United States, and what's also very significant, to interpret any political development in any region of the world as a conspiracy of United States against us, against Russia. The classical example of this dementia is how Russian leaders and propaganda office explains Arab Spring. They sincerely believe the Arab Spring is a conspiracy of United States. When I humbly begin to explain them that United States will never will have in Egypt president more loyal to USA and to Israel than Mubarak, well, they immediately invent other theories that, well, United States wants turmoil in the Middle East to undermine Europe as an economic ally, and so on. And it's not only Putin mentality. I remember so-called liberal Medvedev several times very passionately explained to audience that this is conspiracy against us, but we are ready to it, and so on. The second grievances of Russian elite is what Putin described as the largest geopolitical catastrophe of 20th century's loss of empire. And the main obsession of Russian political class is so-called domination on post-Soviet space. For 20 years of independent Russia, different projects of unification, of Eurasian Union, and so on are designed and suggested to our neighbors without any success. And Kremlin blames America again for that. America is intriguing against our unification project on post-Soviet space. But the fact is that America had nothing to do with it. These projects are flatly rejected by all our neighbors, by the elites, and by the people, irrespectively of their political model. Democrats, Saakashvili, or plutocrats, Lukashenko, Nazarbayev, are equally absolutely disinterested in any megalomaniac Moscow project. And the third grievance is addressed to the United States by Russian political elite is certainly the popular opposition to Putinism. The official theory was that demonstration on Bolotnaya, on Sakharov Square, was organized by United States, by spies, by NGO organization sponsored, and personally by Hillary Clinton. And again, they sincerely believe in it. So the addressing to these formal grievances, it's impossible to to change anything in Russian-American relationship, because animosity to the United States is a fundamental feature of psyche and behavior of political elite. Well, René Descartes taught that cogito ergo sum, and for them, confront America, denounce America, screw America, ergo sum. It's not of a statement. I know these people and interact this, and this is not anti-Americanism from below, which political class and rules should take into consideration and follow it. Quite on the contrary. This, first of all, it's the complexes of political elite which are translated to the public through TV by their propaganda. So I think my verdict on this reset, that it was intellectual failure. The architects of reset just don't understand the nature and mentality of Russian rulers. Like many of their predecessors, could not understand mentality of Uncle Joe or mentality of Brezhnev Politburo. This is about reset was invented in 4 years of reset. What is the future of reset? Future of reset is even more gloomy for my view, because Russia is entering a new political era. This is era of public political show trials. Each authoritarian regime follows approximately the same evolution in its development. And the final stage of degradation of personal authoritarian regime into totalitarian dictatorship is certainly show trials. Today, on this April 2nd, 22nd, in Moscow is already almost 8 o'clock in the evening. The first show trial began, and even its first session already ended. It's a very special show trial. It's one of the several dozens of accused. Somebody named Konstantin Lebedev confessed in his terrible crimes, and these terrible crimes is organizing protest demonstration on Bolotnaya Square in Moscow on May 6, under instruction, sponsorship and financial support of Georgian special services. And the only proof of their crime is videotape, presumably shown on TV, presumably demonstrating the meeting of Lebedev and some other his comrades with Georgian member of parliament Givi Tarkamadze. But irony is that when this tape was demonstrated on TV, it was fixed that it was made, this meeting took place in June. So in June, they discuss organizing mass riot in Moscow in May. This Czechist time machine is not the only absurdity of this process. There's a terrible story about other guy, Leonid Razvozhaev, a colleague of this Konstantin Lebedev, whose trial has begun today. Razvozhaev was abducted on the territory of foreign state. He was abducted in Ukraine when he tried to get shelter at the United Nations Commission of Refugees. For several days, he was tortured, and they extracted from him so-called confessions. But when they took him in Moscow to the court building to formalize his arrest, he cried that I was abducted, and I was tortured, just exposing their behavior and methods they used. They were so furious that they charged him with additional crime, the slandering police officers, and sent him to the tour on the most hideous prisons in Siberia, where he was again routinely, physically and psychologically abused. It's a new level of depravity and criminal behavior of this regime. Abductions, tortures, show trials. It's already practice of Stalin-Hitler type of regime. So we live already in absolutely different Russia. And again, all this traditional anti-Americanism posture will be used widely during this process, because the main accusation that all these protests were organized by foreign agents on pay of United States and their allies. I want to preempt one question which is usually asked in such audience: how could we help to Russian democracy, to Russian human rights movement? What should be United States policy toward Russia? My answer at this stage of our history is we don't expect nothing, because this regime may be overthrown only through internal dynamics of Russian processes, political processes. The timing of its fall depends on how many people will come in 3 weeks on May 6 on demonstration of protest. It depends on infighting inside elites, because a lot of people inside the elite and inside Kremlin itself are very much appalled with this new development, this new stage, which reminds us so vividly showed rise, Stalin showed rise of 30s, and Stalin failed show trial on 1953. You remember that then in 1953, Stalin was preparing first the medieval trial of Jewish physicians, and then the trial of his Politburo comrades. But that time he failed, most probably was killed by members of Politburo, and that was another story. What would happen this time, I don't know. But for United States, relationship with the regime of this type is not a matter of influence event, not a matter of affecting Russia's future. It's rather a matter of choosing its own moral position. And it's a matter of standing of United States in future post-Putin Russia. Because now many Americans are perplexed by the level of anti-American mood in post-revolutionary Egypt. But to much extent, this anti-American is explained by the fact that the United States provides support to dictator Mubarak practically until the last day of his rule. As for resetting, I think that this administration will continue this futile policy of resetting, which was very vividly confirmed by latest visit of Mr. Donilon to Moscow. He met with Putin, with Lavrov, and Lavrov made a very despising comments that, well, Kerry and Donilon, both of them understand that Americans made mistakes affecting our relations. They try to improve. Well, but we judge them not by their words, but by their deeds. Not only Lavrov, but all Russian people in post-Putin Russia will judge Americans not by their words, but by their deeds. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Andrei. Now I will follow your remarks. Unlike Andrei, I approach Russian affairs to a certain extent as an outside observer. But in that capacity, there are certain things that, of course, one notices and that are often valuable. We've had some very striking events in the last couple of weeks. I'm not going to refer right now to the events in Boston, but we'll come back to those, particularly in the question period. What I'm thinking of right now, for the purposes of just opening this discussion, are the events around the Magnitsky case, the publication of the names of those who were participants in the murder of Sergei Magnitsky, as you know, a Russian anti-corruption lawyer, who was killed because of his attempt to prevent the robbery by officials of the Russian state treasury. At the same time, another striking event was the death of Boris Berezovsky, who was found hanged in his home outside of London under extremely mysterious and suspicious circumstances. What strikes me about the Magnitsky case is the fact that the Russian government has treated as an assault on the government itself and on the entire country the attempt of international society to in some way limit the activities of those who are stealing from the Russian government. In that way, they have made clear that they have no interest in preventing such thefts, and on the contrary, identify themselves completely with those who are carrying them out. The case of Boris Berezovsky is also extremely interesting. I'm not a forensic investigator, but there are certain aspects of this death that just don't make sense to me. One is on the general psychological level. Boris Berezovsky is a man who obsessively pursued anything that money could buy, whether it was, whether it was mansions, whether it was women, whether it was officials, whether it was status. At his 60th birthday party, at which Alexander Litvinenko and what was Lugovoy's first name? In any case, I'm not sure if it was Alexander Lugovoy, but what?
Andrei.
What? Andrei Lugovoy, I'm sorry. Were both in attendance, Lugovoy later being accused of the murder of Litvinenko. It was a tribute to conspicuous consumption, to the an obsession with money and material goods, Does a person with that psychology want to depart this material world? And for what reason? More interesting, does a person setting out to commit suicide lock the bathroom door behind him? For what purpose? If he's alone in the house, so that no one will find his body? And does a person who's been engaged for years in a battle to destroy the reputation of the president of Russia, of Vladimir Putin, does such a person commit suicide without leaving a suicide note and after having written a letter to Putin that can be used by his archenemy to explain his death? All of it psychologically makes very little sense. What does make sense is the notion that the Russian leadership is determined to eliminate its political enemies. And there was a reminder of this, of course, in the earlier fate of Alexander Litvinenko. Andrei Lugovoy, who was, by all indications, the person who murdered him, returned to Russia, where the authorities denied the request for extradition that was filed by the British government, and proceeded to nominate him for a position in the upper house of the Russian parliament, which is where he sits to this day. So if we take these three events, on the one hand, the determination of the Russian regime to defend those guilty of the murder of an anti-corruption lawyer, who was in fact acting in the interests of the government itself, the strange and almost incomprehensible death of Boris Berezovsky, if we see it as a suicide instead of a murder, and the refusal to cooperate with the investigation into the murder of Alexander Litvinenko. The question arises, I mean, is the Russian regime actually trying to tell us something about itself? Do we not see in all these three cases a common element? And that is the effort of an organized criminal group to treat itself, to guarantee it itself against external challenges, and to impose on the world a false picture of itself, at the same time as it does the same in relation to its own population. If indeed that is the case, what are the prospects for such a regime? And how ought the United States to deal with it? There's much that can be said about Russia, and there's Bismarck. It was undoubtedly correct when he said that Russia is never as strong as it seems, and never as weak as it seems. But insofar as Russia has attempted to reassert its influence in Europe and has, to a certain extent, refused its cooperation in important national security issues with the United States, it's worth pointing out that Russia, present-day Russia under Putin, who gives every indication of seeking to rule for life, has very fundamental weaknesses. And those fault lines in the Russian situation are very likely to be aggravated in the years ahead with serious implications, both for Russia itself and for U.S. Russian relations. I think the first weakness is simply the nature of the political situation that's been created in Russia. I received an extremely vivid illustration of this when I made a recent trip to the Krasnodar region in southern Russia. There were two issues there that concerned me. One were the events in a small town called Kushovskaya Stanitsa, and the other, the flood that took place in the town of Krimsk. I'm working on a new book. I've written several books about Russia. I'm working on a new book, and these incidents were important to me, and I wanted to go and talk to people who were involved in them. In the case of Kushevskaya Stanitsa, what happened was this. The local gang that ran the place, ran the town, decided to settle with one of their enemies, and surrounded the house in which they were entertaining guests, and murdered 12 people, including 2 infants. The son of one of the guests tried to flee, and a 12-year-old boy, and they tracked him down and shot him. Then they set the corpses on fire. There are horrible killings take place everywhere. But what was interesting in this case was that the leader of the gang was a former deputy. The leader of the gang of murderers was a former deputy in the regional parliament. Not only that, he had been a guest at the inauguration of Dmitry Medvedev and was a close associate of the regional government and a business partner of him. Now, the only reason that this mass killing came to the attention of anyone was because just by chance, a television crew from the first television channel was in Kushevskaya Stanitsa reporting on something completely different when the bodies of the victims were found. And a note went out over, and a story went out over national television, which was the first step in revealing that the entire region was being run by gangsters, and that there was a veritable reign of terror in the region. Now, the governor of Krasnodar, of the broader state, what's called Krasnodar Krai, is named Alexander Tkachev. And he's a powerful figure and close friend of Putin's. Did this result in any action being taken against Tkachev? Not at all. Despite the revelation that that gangsters were the legitimate political authorities, and not only were they the legitimate political authorities, the leading philanthropists and social activists in the region at times when they weren't busy carrying out mass killings. But there was no reaction at all. Well, last July, another incident took place in the same Krasnodar Krai, the same Krasnodar region. We've got the distinction between, as those of you who know Russian administrative delineations are aware, between Krai, Oblast, Rayon. Now we're talking about Rayon, which is more like a district. The Krimsk Rayon was in a floodplain. People, of course, had been forbidden to build in the flood vulnerable areas. In return for bribes, the construction went on anyway. Money had been allocated to clean the riverbed of garbage and debris, so as to reduce the possibility of a catastrophe. The money was pocketed. The river was never cleaned. And on the night when an enormous downpour took place in the hills surrounding Krimsk, the local authorities did not bother to alert the population of the danger. They knew a good 3.5 hours before a wall of water descended on Krimsk that the town was in danger of being swept away. The word was received in the local administration in the town of Krimsk at 10:30. The independent television station Electron TV was a 5-minute walk away. It would have been possible to put a notation on the television, with warning on television, just to run a script. It would have been possible to announce it on the radio. People who were aware that bridges were being washed away, that cities higher up above Krimsk were being destroyed, that an incredible wall of water was descending on the city, called frantically to people to warn them, but it was too late for most people, many of whom were trapped in their homes. The water filled the first floor apartments so rapidly that people could not open the doors, and there were bars on the windows, and so they drowned in their homes. About 200 people could not escape and died. Afterwards, Tkachov came to Krimsk, and when an angry crowd demanded an explanation why there was no warning, he said, "Well, what do you think, that we should have gone and knocked on the door of everyone?" As if that was the most outrageous thing anyone could suggest. The tempers did run high in Krimsk afterwards. But Putin arrived and announced that they were paying 1 million rubles for 2 million rubles, in fact, as compensation for each person who had died, and that they were going to finance a massive compensation program. It is a testimony to the challenge that is faced by the opposition, that several months later, when a new mayor, that this to a certain extent blunted the anger, and several months later, when a new mayor was elected in Krimsk, the ruling party won. The same party that was responsible, whose members were responsible for not informing the residents of the town that they were about to be flooded. And Tkachov has not been removed. He continues to play a key role in Russia, especially in preparation for the Sochi Olympics. But this kind of criminal negligence and connection of the authorities to organized crime has its limits. Despite the success so far of the authorities in managing the situation, it is by its nature a degenerating situation which will provoke more negligence, more crimes, and ultimately more than passive resistance, particularly as it is linked to an economy which is becoming more and more vulnerable. The Russian economy is highly monopolized, and one of the reasons that it's possible to make so much money in Russia, and why many businessmen, even if they live in England, they have their children in England, they have their money in England or in London or the U.S. or Miami Beach, wherever they have it, they maintain their business in Russia, is because if they can get a 10 or 15% profit in the West, in Russia the profit is more like 100 or 150%. And the reason is because they use corrupt ties to the local administration, or in the case of big business to the central authorities, in order to eliminate competition. They effectively work without competition, and anyone seeking to compete on normal economic grounds would quickly find himself in danger of losing his business, and in fact would be in danger of ending up in prison. Because the technique now is not the technique that was used during the Yeltsin years, according to which anybody who stood in the way of an aggressively expanding businessman would just end up dead. Now the organs of law enforcement simply place them in pretrial detention, and there are thousands of Russian businessmen who are sitting in Russian prisons for resisting the efforts of those with connections to take over their businesses. Needless to say, this is a highly inefficient way of running an economy, and it's one of the reasons why Russia's credit rating is so low, why its rate of capital flight is so high, why the level of investment is so low, and why, in fact, after years of really spectacular economic growth based on the sharp rise in the price of commodities, Russia is now facing economic stagnation, and that's confirmed by the economic figures in the first part of this year. And insofar as the windfall from commodities was not used in order to improve the infrastructure of the country or develop industry, but on the contrary, was used to line the pockets of those people who monopolize property and power in the country, once there's a sharp fall in the value of commodities as a result of any global slowdown, Russia will be plunged into crisis immediately. And finally, with reference also to the Boston events, is the national, the vulnerability of Russia on national grounds. In 2000, after the successful crushing of the separatist revolt in Chechnya, temporary though it may be, was accompanied by the spread of the insurrection to the rest of the North Caucasus and its transformation from a separatist revolt into an Islamic fundamentalist terrorist revolt. The second Chechen War, during the first Chechen War, the Islamists, despite all their efforts and despite all their money, had very little success. In the second war, they began to be a factor. And there began to be a split in the Chechen opposition between Islamists on the one hand and the separatists on the other. But the tactics used by the Russians in Chechnya, which led, massive security sweeps, the disappearance of anyone who was suspected of any type of resistance activity, actually swung the balance in the direction of the Islamists, who began using suicide bombers and relying on terrorist tactics. Eventually, as we know, or as many of you may know, the revolt in Chechnya itself was suppressed, but the Islamist resistance spread to Dagestan, Ingushetia, the Kabardino-Balkaria, other regions in the North Caucasus. And it is that group which, on the one hand, continued to fight the Russians, and on the other resorted to terrorism in Moscow itself. After the events of last year, in which the democratic opposition took to the streets in Moscow, Doku Umarov, a former Chechen field commander who declared himself the emir of the North Caucasus Emirate, Islamic Emirate, said that there would be no further terrorist attacks on Russians, insofar as Russian civilians, insofar as the Russian people had shown that they were ready to oppose Putin. So far, as far as we know, as far as I know, he's kept his word, and as we know, he has stated that his group had nothing to do with the events in Boston. True or not true, that's what he's said. He had not hesitated to claim responsibility for other terrorist acts, including the bombing of the Domodedova arrivals hall at the Domodedova airport. So there's some reason for believing that what he says is true, but obviously it requires further investigation. But the attempt to suppress separatism, beginning with Chechnya and the North Caucasus, and the tactics that were used by the Russians, were a contributing factor to the situation which threatens them and us. Now, finally, given these vulnerabilities, what is the role of the United States? What ought we what should we be doing? I mean, there are some people who call themselves realists. They like to, I guess that means everybody who's not a realist is a fantasist or something, I don't know. Or, now, of course, their enemies could call them the pseudo-realists, in which case then there would be the real realists. But without getting into all that, they say that, listen, we can't change Russia. We can't really even influence it. We need to deal with our pragmatic concerns. I don't agree with that argument, and I don't like it, but I don't think it should be dismissed. I think it needs to be answered, and I think there are a couple of things to bear in mind. First of all, regarding the actions like the Magnitsky list, Russians have created a situation in which they were free to steal in Russia and then enjoy their ill-gotten gains in the West. And the more outrageous their behavior, the more they counted on Western greed and indifference to ignore the fact that we were becoming de facto, we were becoming complicit de facto in their crimes. Obviously, that can't go on forever, simply because it's a form of moral pressure on any society to be confronted with the obligation to ignore crimes that take place in which we are somehow involved or connected. At the same time, given the forces that exist in the world and exemplified by the Boston bombings, including the horrendous threat of terrorism and political and religious fanaticism, the United States simply must assert its values in the world as a form of self-protection. And we can't make Russia an exception. It's too large a country, too critical, and it would be too inconsistent with our long-term goals to do so. So for all these reasons, the reset policy, which was conceived, I think, out of a set of bureaucratic cliches that don't apply to Russia, i.e., the notion that, well, if we can get what we want from them by treating their largely false, imaginary, or unjustified grievances as if they were real and justified, it doesn't work. And in moving ahead, we need to be aware of that, and also be aware of the power of moral influence that only a democratic and decent and law-based society can influence. Now, I'm going to finally turn the podium over to Andrei Ilarionov, and then after he's done, of course, we'll have time for questions and discussion.
Right. Thank you, David. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My colleagues, Andrei and David, have covered a wide range of issues concerning the topic that has been announced, and also some other issues, and I'm sure that different aspects of the current development, internal development of Russia, will be touched in a Q&A session, including domestic politics and economics and many other issues. Therefore, I will try to use my short comments here at this moment to cover the issues that have been posed as questions for this session: U.S.-Russia relations, the current state, and possible future. And here already both Andrei and David have actually said a lot, very important issues with which I agree. Also, I would attract attention of those who didn't follow yet to the very interesting and very useful discussions of between the so-called realist and idealist. David has mentioned it just recently. And over the last couple of months, there is a big debate is going on in the American interest for those who read in English, and in Yosh who prefer Russian. And it is interesting that in this debate there is no national border, there is no national division between so-called Americans and Russians. No. This is pretty clear, some kind of Americans and Russians in the camp of so-called realists, and Americans and Russians in the camp of so-called idealists. I don't think that these terms are some kind of really correct, and I would use probably not only pseudo-realist, but probably surrealist for those who are in the Z camp. And actually those who claim themselves idealist, I found them quite realistic people. But nevertheless, it is interesting that, for example, in this realist camp, we would find such some kind of people like Tom Graham or Steve Cohen on the American side, or Fyodor Lukyanov, Dmitry Trenin, and Vladislav Inozemtsev on the Russian side. As for idealists, we would find such a person like David Kramer or David Sutter from the American side, or Lilia Shevtsova and Andrei Piontkovsky on the Russian side. So that is quite clear that it's not a national division. It's ideological, political, and I would say some kind of worldview vision division between those camps. And it is very interesting to see how those camps arguing and what kind of arguments they're putting forward in debating those issues. This debate and this discussion is not happening only for the last couple of months. Actually, it happens more or less regularly in the first months of almost each new U.S. administration. Almost 4 years ago, almost exactly 4 years ago, U.S. Congress, House Committee on Foreign Affairs, had a special hearing which was called, interesting, just please listen carefully, from competition to collaboration. It's just a term that has been used by the U.S. Congress, strengthening the U.S.-Russia relationship. So that's why the approach that has been taken by U.S. administration 4 years ago. I would use this opportunity just to make a quotation from my comments that I have made on these hearings that I think are relevant to our current discussion. Because it seems to me it has some value. I was saying that time that since the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the formation of independent Russia, that time were two U.S. administrations of Bill Clinton and of George Bush began their terms with clear formulated goal to improve the U.S.-Russia cooperation. Each of the administrations started their terms with great expectations for fruitful bilateral relations. Regardless of their individual approaches, personal attitudes, content of issues at the agenda, both U.S. administrations have invested heavily in terms of time, efforts, attention of their key members, including both presidents, into improvement of the U.S.-Russia relations. Both administrations have created special bodies for development of these relations. Many delegations have crossed the ocean, many hours have been spent in the conversations, many decisions have been taken. The outcomes of all these efforts are very well known. They were outright failures in both cases. Russia failed to be integrated into the community of democratic, peaceful nations. Each U.S. administration has finished its terms in the office with U.S.-Russian relations at much lower level than they were at its beginning. And the leading feeling at the end of this administration term was widely shared disappointment, both among members of the administrations and in the Russian and the U.S. societies. And I was that time took some courage to predict that the end of the next administration, that time the first term of the Obama administration, would be pretty similar, as it was similar was the beginning of that. And it seems to me now we are, at least after the first Obama administration, we are in a pretty similar position. Now relations, U.S.-Russia relations, at much lower level than it was at the very beginning when this reset has been proclaimed, as Andrei has described it. So now we have a very clear pattern that we have seen already at least 3 times over the last couple of decades. Very high expectations at the very beginning, and a very deep disappointment, and frankly speaking, serious failures at the end. So these pattern, expectations, promises, substantial efforts, and huge disappointments are repeating already for the 3rd time, and I would once again predict that it will happen again, regardless of the efforts of the Obama administrations again during the 2nd term. So we can ask ourselves, what is the problem? What is the reason, or what are the reasons why we can see the same similar pattern? So since we have, at least on the American side, we have three very different, distinctly different administrations, Bill Clinton, George Bush, and now Barack Obama. And also we have at least some changes on the Russian side, at least from Boris Yeltsin, and after that for a long period of time with Mr. Putin. So we probably cannot explain this very well known and repeated pattern due to personal reasons, and not probably to the reasons of differences in some kind of political or partisan approach in the US administrations. So that is why we need to look for some kind of more fundamental explanation. And let me put forward for your consideration and for our discussion the hypothesis of so-called not personal but structural reasons of the repetition of these some kind of similar pattern in the US-Russia relations. So whom should we blame in this regard? Which side, US or Russia, or both? Let me start with Russia. And it's a lot has been already said, and so certainly those of you who have followed the events in Russia know the basic information about that. I would mention three key elements of the current political regime in Russia. First of all, it is undemocratic authoritarian in domestic policy, which makes not easy for the US administration to deal with. Though we know that US administrations sometimes have reasonably good friends among some authoritarian regimes, nevertheless it's much harder to have more stable relations rather than with democracies. More important, two other elements. In foreign policy, US administration, as well as the rest of the world, do deal with the current Russian administration as revisionist power, which is very clear, and it has been mentioned already that the current Russian administration is considering the dissolution of the Soviet Union as a great geopolitical catastrophe, and is trying to some kind of repair, fix some consequences of this collapse, trying to establish sphere of privileged interests, and sort of with different operations, including external wars in the so-called near abroad, including recent war against Georgia. Another very important element concerned the leading so-called component in legal sphere. It cannot be called legal. I would say it's a kind of just in political studies or in legal studies, usually in the United States and in many other Western countries, put the comparison rule of law versus rule of a man, and that's something that has been taught. The American students have been taught. In the Russian case, we are not having neither rule of law nor rule of a man. We have rule of thugs, and that's different. And this is a very important element. That's exactly the example that has been given by David in explaining what has happened in Khrushchevskaya. Because it's not a rule of a man. It's not a rule of some kind of strict authoritarian regime or totalitarian regime. That's a rule of thugs, and it's pretty different. And with thugs, you cannot rely sometimes as you can rely in international relations even on authoritarian or even totalitarian dictator. That's a different type of political regime. And because of these three elements, authoritarian political system, revisionist policy in foreign affairs spheres, and some kind of rule of thugs in terms of legal basis, all these three elements make this regime incredibly unpredictable, incredibly unreliable, both internationally and domestically. I need to mention here that of these relations between US and Russia over these years, we have seen that US administrations were in a permanent retreat in foreign policies. And we have seen this retreat on almost any visible issues that that have been under discussion, whether it was some kind of in the 90s, Bill Clinton administration were some kind of courageous enough to some kind of criticize Russian administrations for dealing in Chechnya, and after a pretty sharp response from Kremlin saying, okay, do not touch this issue, American administrations have been shut up and did not discuss this issue anymore and does not discuss it now. And we can see that the sphere of privileged interests is actually that has been considered in year 2008 when it was proclaimed by the Russian administration as completely some kind of unacceptable by some of US officials. Now it is quietly has been accepted. And now, as we can see, US administration do not intervene and do not discuss and do not argue with the Russian administrations in no country of the post-Soviet space, with probable exception of Baltic countries, which is quite clear success and victory of this concept of privileged interests. And moreover, as we have seen with the development of issue of missiles, this continues even in Poland and Czech Republic, which is not the former Soviet Union territory. As for, as we move to, so just what is going on in Russia is more or less known. It has been described, and the situation is more or less understandable. But the question arises, why US administration still repeating the same approach and making the same or very similar mistakes towards Russia? Are the US officials so blind, or are we stupid? Why they continue repeat the same or similar mistakes over the period of time? If we look into those people who are some kind of structuring a US policy towards Russia, we cannot say that they are blind, that they are not stupid. They are very intelligent, smart people, and they do understand very well what is going on in Russia. The question arises, why, nevertheless, they continue this policy? And here I have my hypothesis, which I'd like to some kind of provide it here, and would be glad to hear your response and comments. I think there are at least a couple of basic explanations. First explanation is that a continued policy that is being named and called as idealistic policy of defending human rights, or division of power, or support and defense of independent media and different branches in Russia, is considered to be too costly for US foreign policy. And return from that approach is considered to be too low, using some kind of economic terminology. So from the purely some kind of economic point of view, if these economic terms could be used, could be applied to this foreign policy. For a number of US administrations, it looks like it's much easier and much more productive from their point of view, do not pursue the policies that would support rule of law, democracy, strengthening institutions of civil society in Russia to the extent that would be able to fight very seriously. It's one possible explanation. The other explanation is geopolitics. Since the United States is engaged in a number of military campaigns, at least was engaged and is still considered to be engaged in Afghanistan, in Iraq, also with potential conflict in Iran, with problems with North Korea, and with most important, with the rising challenge from China and militant Islam, the chance to have another problem with Russia or in Russia is considered to be unacceptable. And in this regard, even a very well-known critic of the Soviet totalitarianism, Zbigniew Brzezinski, has changed his mind very considerably. Some kind of saying now that the modern Russia does not does not create any serious problem for the United States. From this point of view, to some extent, modern Russia, or today's Russia, and today's China has some kind of shifted places among themselves compared to what we have seen maybe a quarter century ago. That time, the Soviet Union was considered to be enemy or some kind of challenge number one for the United States, and that is why to deal with this challenge, it would be good to have reasonably good or at least neutral relations with the number two. Since then, USSR was a more dangerous threat for the United States, so that is why it would be good to have better relations with China. Since now, China probably considered to be much more serious potential threat today and tomorrow for the United States, so that is why for US administrations to have good or reasonably good or neutral relations with Russia is considered to be as a priority compared to have any serious problem with Russia. If it is true, it means that geopolitics probably defines very seriously the current state of US-Russia relations and probably future relations between our two countries. And if it is true, since Russia is not going to be anytime soon, or actually it will never be, it will never come as the number one challenger to US or to any other country of the world in terms of military might, economic power, political strength. So that is why it would be one of some kind of middle-sized regional powers, but it will never be so small as Libya or Syria or Iraq. So that is why for any foreseeable future probably we have a very similar approach of the US administrations towards Russia that we have today. Thank you.
Okay, well, thanks to our panelists, and now I will take your questions and direct them to our panelists, and I will also be available to if you want to ask me any questions. Yes, please, this young lady. And yeah, and please identify yourself when you ask a question.
Sure. My name is Anna Dillon.
Anna,
Does this work? Everybody hears me? Okay, good. My name is Anna Dillon. I work for the National Affairs Office of the Church of Scientology here in D.C.
Mm-hmm.
I'm Russian myself, so
Mm-hmm.
right now I live and work here, but I used to live and work there, and I have still family there and friends and everything, so I'm pretty much in the loop on what's going on there too. And my question is probably to everybody, but mainly to Andrei Piontkovsky, because he was the first speaker who mentioned anti-American propaganda in Russia, which I'm aware of myself. It was definitely a lot of it on the web. It's a lot of it on TV, on state channels, and so on. I want to make my question short, but at the same time clear for everybody. So we'll just do a little introduction, because I'm not sure that everybody is as aware of legislation in Russia. We have the situation in Russia where there is a lot of anti-Western, anti-American propaganda, which creates atmosphere of intolerance towards anything American. And at the same time, there is a lot of legislation happening, especially within the last couple of years, which is totally violating human rights standards that Russia is obliged to, but like the law on foreign agents that was supposed to make it mandatory for any NGO that gets some foreign funding to get labeled or label itself as a foreign agent, which in Russian pretty much means a foreign spy. So NGOs didn't want to do that, and recently, a few weeks ago, we had the situation where raids started, like the Office of Amnesty International in Russia was raided. As far as I know, Human Rights Watch was raided. A lot of advocacy groups were raided. So the atmosphere that's being created is intolerance, and it's just intimidating for everybody who wants to stand for democracy. So we have a situation where NGOs don't really cooperate with each other, and people don't cooperate with NGOs and with human rights groups.
Maybe we should just. What is your?
What
is your question?
Yeah, my question is, how do you think, you having like very in-depth knowledge of all of that, how do you think we should outweigh this propaganda? Because there's a lot of state propaganda on particular channels. It's very coordinated. People are getting the same message, but in opposition, people don't. And how can we educate people at the grassroots level on what's happening? Because we should do something. It's not just we can talk about it, but then say we can't do anything about it. We have to.
All right, let's let our panelists react to that.
Yep.
Andrei, do you want to?
You know, I used to write a lot on foreign affairs, and I first became known and got reputation just as an expert of foreign policy in Russia.
Yeah, Andrei, you.
Excuse me. I said that initially I was more known as an expert on foreign policy, and in my writing I very sharply criticized, ridiculed all this cliché of anti-American propaganda, trying to affect the mentality of not only our people but our leaders, because in the beginning, in 2001, 2002, well, there was real struggle in the Kremlin about course on foreign policy, and Putin was, by the way, not the most hardline anti-American. Moreover, he was pragmatic. As a KGB man, he was pragmatic. And his first reaction to 9/11, his decision to support American, very seriously American operation in Afghanistan, was taken against the view of majority of Russian political class. And so, to some extent, I'm fighting for Putin also, and I know that he read my article, and but all his very healthy instinct were overcome by huge traditional community, and by the way, even not military community. Military people are always were more reasonable. I mean, first of all, this foreign policy community. They, because these people, I talked in my presentation about this complex on inferiority suffered by Russian elite after losing the status of superpower. And these foreign office people suffered most, because they were at the center of this. And I was this fight. And Andrei knows his history. He several times helped me, and I gave my some memorandums to Putin, and I abandoned this fight. I am not writing about foreign policy at all for many years. I am fighting because without changing this regime, the foreign policy will not be changed. And Russia and the United States are natural allies in 21st century, because both Russia and United States are challenged by the same forces, Islamic radical and rising China. And by the way, Russia is much more vulnerable to these threats than United States. She will be the first victim of both enemies, and it's natural that that Russia is more interested, basically existentially interested, in strategic alliance with United States. But it is impossible to explain to the current generation of Russian leaders.
Okay, oh yes, Andrei, go ahead.
I would add just a few words to what Andrei has said. First of all, probably we need to a little bit correct this ideology of anti-Americanism. I would call it pro-American anti-Americanism or anti-American pro-Americanism. And what I have in mind, if you remember, just a couple of months ago, Mr. Pertin, deputy of the State Duma, has some kind of resigned from the State Duma because he has a property in Florida. So he preferred to have property in Florida rather than to stay as a deputy of the State Duma. So which shows the real state of the so-called anti-Americanism. So probably among some members of United Russia, because he's a very prominent member of United Russia, feelings towards America is much stronger than towards Mr. Putin and towards the State Duma. So that is why we should differentiate very accurately between two types of ideology. One ideology for personal consumption, which is pro-American in terms of having property, sending their kids to universities or some kind of, to their wives to Los Angeles to live or to good life, or in Florida and some other places. On the other case, anti-American, it's ideology for public consumption, for those who are not members of the so-called Russian elite. And for those general population, this is a very good product. This is indispensable product. Over the last 13 years, a number of other ideological products have been tried to some kind of, as a glue for the calls, this kind of for general public. They tried anti-Chechen campaign, anti-Chechenism, or anti-Estonian campaign, anti-Lithuanian campaign, anti-Ukrainian campaign, anti-Georgian campaign. Look, they are not too strong. I mean, they're not too important. They're not too powerful. So it is possible to keep Russian society in some kind of in a situation of tense, some kind of tense relation toward those countries for some time, not for long. And in this regard, only United States can play this role as a powerful, as a serious, as a military power, as economic power, as somebody who could potentially threaten in the eyes, in the some kind of unconscious of general public, Russia. So that is why, as long as the United States will be #1 in the world, and as long as this political regime will stay in power in Russia, we shall have the same anti-Americans, because nothing can change it. Certainly, if some kind of the ranking in the world powers will change, that probably will happen, and probably not in a reasonable future. So that time probably we can see some changes, but until that, there is no way to change this attitude, at least from the Russian government and the Russian regime, in terms of main chief ideology.
Why don't we first start with our Polish colleague and then Kurt.
Hello, my name is Witold Rotkiewicz, and I'm from Center for Eastern Studies in Warsaw, which is a kind of think tank which deals with countries east of Poland mostly. And I have basically three questions to each of the panelists. But I also would like to have a comment, if I'm allowed to.
Yeah, sure. Let's just.
We can. I mean, there is a short.
Yeah, just keep it
intervention,
concise.
long
Yeah.
Intervention. I don't know where I'm allowed.
Well,
Okay. So let me start with a couple of things that came to my mind when I was listening to these excellent presentations. First has to do with this triangular relationship between Russia, U.S. and China. And the first provocative comment that I would want to make was if the United States is interested in having good relations with Russia, and we heard a history, an excellent analysis of structural reasons why the relations have been bad during the last, basically the entire post-Soviet period. Perhaps if you look at the Chinese policy towards Russia, you could see how effective it is and how China enjoys good relationship with Putin regime. That's something to think about. Second, on the same topic, you hear in Washington from American experts a kind of hopes or kind of strategic designs which run along the line that Russia and U.S. should be natural allies against China, so we should try to improve relations with Russia also because of the Chinese factor. I think this is an illusion, at least as long as we have the current regime in power. I think the lesson that this regime has drawn from history of relationship with China is that exactly because China can be a serious threat, an extremely serious threat, they know Russia cannot afford a conflict with China. So they are going to follow the policy they have been following during the last 15 years. And also, one of the key reasons is because China does not offer an alternative model of governance. It's not a threat internally as America is by its very nature, the way it functions, the way it as an alternative model. Okay, so that's one comment on China. Okay, let me come to questions.
Yeah.
To Mr. Sutter, I would love to hear more about this alternative policy to the so-called realist policy, because to say we should take a stand on human rights and we should follow a principled approach, that's very fine. I'm all for it, and I'm not being facetious. I'm serious. But the problem is whenever you try to sell this line, also in Europe, you are confronted with the question, okay, so in practice, what you suggest we should do in terms of real practical policy? So that's one question. To Mr. Ilarionov, I just would like to take advantage of this opportunity because you are here the only person who really had a chance to interact close to the Putin circle. And we've observed during the last, let's say, year since the situation in Russia became internally more, let's say, convoluted after the protests, a dynamic also within the elite. Could you venture a scenario of what kind of dynamic these pressures that we are observing are likely to produce within the elite? We see these anti-corruption drive. We see this legislation on bank accounts, discussions about property, and so on, so on, so on. Okay, I would love to hear you to comment on that. And to Mr. Piontkovsky, and I'm thinking about your analysis of the reasons why Russia or the regime follows this kind of anti-American policy. And I would just give a provocative response to you. Perhaps the best way for America to have a good relationship with this regime, which might be useful for various practical reasons, is to indulge it in its wish to become recognized as a great power, and that perhaps will solve the problem. Okay. Thanks.
Well, why don't we've got. It's been tried, but just briefly, as far as I'm concerned, the alternative to the so-called realist policy is actually to be realistic and merely to treat Russia as it is, without effusive and pointless demonstrations of goodwill which are not earned, without concessions to Russia strategic concessions to Russia which are not in the American interest, and without an acceptance of their distorted view of reality, to which we should give no credit at all. Obviously, in the post-Soviet and the post-communist era, the real issue for the world is what Russia does within its own borders. But nonetheless, the attitude, I think, of the United States should simply be an insistence on principles, and do not allow Russia to sell acts that it takes in its own strategic interest as concessions for which they need to be rewarded. Do not make unilateral do not compromise unilaterally American security in the face of mendacious Russian propaganda. Do not accept their distorted view of the rule of law in situations like the Magnitsky case, where the United States or its interests or people who have interests in the United States are involved. None of this actually may change things all that much, but it will affirm a basic principle, which is that the states that are based on law should establish the context of relationships with the lawless states and not the other way around. Why don't both Andreis probably want to answer the questions directed again to them, and then Kurt, maybe you'll go.
Well, about this problem of grandeur perdue, it's not purely Russian. The French elite suffered from this problem also, and they find a solution in personality of de Gaulle, who began to repeat everyday grandeur de France. But the best solution was in advance invented by Brits, who named their country Great Britain. So no complexes at all. As for your suggestion, it was tried. It was tried by Bush. It was tried by Clinton. After all, Russia was taken into G7 club and so on. Well, unfortunately, it doesn't work. And I make one comment on your comments on China triangle. Well, you're absolutely right that in spite of all the facts, in spite of all the national interests, this government, this regime will never abandon its policy of animosity to the West and creeping to the China. But it will change. The same was with the Soviet Union. But Stalin changed its policy of hate for the West and close friendship with Hitler Germany. He changes immediately in one day, June 22nd, 1941. So Russia also, Moscow also changed its policy when this Chinese 22nd June of 21 on maybe 2021 will come. Finally, a popular anecdote from Soviet times, especially during fighting with Chinese, with Damansky. Everything is quiet on Polish-Chinese border.
On the question, what kind of policy could we expect? Actually, its policy we can only not only expect, but also we having this policy, and this is a policy of combination of two approaches. One is a heavy hand, and the other is a so-called soft power. As for heavy hand, it's nothing special to discuss and debate and describe. Just look in Belarus. Belarus, with a time lag of 2-3 years, and what was going in Belarus over the last 15 years, it's exactly what's going in Russia with some lag of 2 to 3 years. So the crackdown on the Belarusian opposition in December year 2010, on the day of the presidential, so-called presidential election in Belarus, it is something that is going on in Russia, slightly extended, not just in one day, not in one night, but just essentially the same destruction of any of organized forces of any kind, and even sometimes not only opposition, but some kind of independent non-governmental organizations, even not involved in politics. But what makes the Russian case quite different from the Belarusian case and from some other heavy and hard authoritarian regimes is it's called use of so-called smart power. And that is exactly what is the difference when the head of the state is not the former chairman of kolkhoz, and in the case of Belarus and the former agent of KGB. It's kind of using of those people who consider to be in a position for removal of some kind of not only enemies or some kind of opponents of the regime, but just independent, more or less independent figures in the political, or some kind of outdated figures in the political scene. For example, a few years ago, as maybe some of you remember, there was a fierce campaign waged by Boris Nemtsov, very famous and visible person of opposition, against Mr. Lushkov. And Mr. Nemtsov that time claimed that, okay, Mr. Lushkov was a part of the regime. Certainly, it's a joke. Mr. Lushkov was never part of the KGB, was never part of the corporation of Mr. Putin. Actually, Mr. Putin was actually eager to remove Mr. Lushkov from the position of the mayor of Moscow, but he did not do it by himself with his own hands, so that is why he preferred to deliver this very important job to Mr. Nemtsov, even to give him a credit for so-called final firing of Mr. Lushkov. Nevertheless, after removal of Mr. Lushkov, a very close friend and ally of Mr. Putin, Mr. Sobyanin, has been installed as the mayor of Moscow. So that is why Mr. Nemtsov has fulfilled dirty work for Mr. Putin. Later, for example, a few years ago, we mentioned this is already, Mr. Navalny was effectively removed Mr. Pechtin and Mr. Malkin from the Russian parliament. So neither Mr. Pechtin nor Mr. Malkin are members of the Putin corporation. But they became outdated persons. They are not needed. They are some kind of for Putin's regime. Nevertheless, they create this image of the so-called anti-corruption campaign. And Mr. Putin now can claim, even probably in a few days when he will have this press conference with journalists, he would say, okay, we are waging anti-corruption campaign, and look at this. Those people who fail with some kind of with fulfillment of our laws have been fired from the parliament. So that is why he is very smart. by the way, and he's using all possible resources, including those who consider to be for public consumption as some kind of on the other side from the other side of political struggle for his own aims, and he's doing it pretty effectively.
Kurt?
My name's Kurt Windsor.
It's a microphone coming.
My name is Curtin Windsor. I'm a trustee of the Hudson Institute and also on the board of several other not-for-profit institutions which have an interest in this subject. One topic that you all have touched on, I think Mr. Ilarionov possibly most specifically, but haven't really nailed, is the Magnitsky project, which it seems to me would be the one area that the United States could effectively use against what you've all described to be essentially a criminal state. Criminals are criminals because they are motivated not by grandeur necessarily, but by self-aggrandizement. And as I think you pointed out, Mr. Ilarionov, very eloquently, these chaps aggrandize themselves in Miami, in London, in New York, Los Angeles. We are just now tentatively naming a few non-essential people, a little bit like Putin is, to bar them from enjoying the fruits of their criminality. You ask what the United States could effectively do against the criminal class or even the political class. This, it strikes me, as being absolutely fundamental, and it's one in which we are right now in the U.S. Political structure very feebly flailing. We could do, it seems to me, much more, and there could be much more done from forums like this and others to encourage much stronger action against people who are fundamentally affecting human rights, rule of law, the entire spectrum of what has become activity that is now bordering on or actually in the area of criminality. I would challenge each of you who've all touched on this subject perhaps to elaborate how the United States could more forcefully engage in this area which almost seems obvious.
I would agree with you theoretically that yes, United States can help a lot to the Russian to development of democracy and democratic institutions and human rights in Russia by using such instruments like Magnitsky Act, and we support it, and even in the Coordination Council. We both, Andrei Piontkovsky and myself, when Andrei was still that time member of the Coordination Council, we supported the necessary resolution. The problem is, in this case, not so much on the Russian side, on the side of the Russian opposition, but here in the United States, as you very well know, because there is also quite a serious split between, at least on one hand, U.S. Congress and U.S. public, general public, and U.S. administration. As you know, Obama administration for all these years was effectively torpedo adoption of any act like Magnitsky Act. And only after U.S. Congress has adopted this act, they produce some list, and instead of more than 200 names that have been supplied by the U.S. congressmen and by the Russian opposition leaders, they produce this list of 18 people of second or even third tier names. And they were so fearful that they will produce, as according to some reports, some kind of names that they were not courageous enough to publicly announce. So that is why we can see problems here, mostly here in the United States, at least in the current administration, rather than compared to the potential possibilities that could be used by the U.S. as a country.
Andrei, do you want to say anything, and then I'll say
a couple of thoughts. Well, I never ask American, Western, foreign audience to make something special for Russia. But Americans made it a lot of good for Russia just following implementing their own legislation. For example, there is U.S. and international legislation against laundering of illegally gained capitals. All property on Miami of Russian origins is, well, 99% illegally gained wealth. The only exception is Mrs. Sharapova and our brilliant hockey players. And you shouldn't restrict by Magnitsky Act, because Magnitsky Act is a very important tool, but it deals with criminals involved in human rights violation, like investigators, prosecutors, judges. But there is a lot of thieves who are not under Magnitsky Act Magnitsky Act provisions. So fulfill your legislation, and plus there is international organization FATF, Financial Action Task Force. Just check the origin of property, and there is gentlemen who are, why nobody approached, it's not a US domain, but why nobody approached Abramovich in London, who is, by the way, state official. He is still chairman of legislative body of Chukotka region. Why nobody approached Mr. Timchenko, Putin KGB body, who for some reason selling one half of Russian oil? So there is a lot of work for you, not to helping specifically Russia, but just implementing your own legislation.
It's also, could I follow up on that just for a moment, David?
Sure, go ahead.
And that is that if hell had a representation, and the U.S. had representation in hell, we wouldn't entirely want to sever relations with it, because our State Department places very high emphasis on keeping contact with whatever government is in power. And we were having this same problem, by the way, with the Venezuelans. And we would only name corrupt Venezuelans who'd been laundering huge amounts of drug money. Again, very few and very minor persons of this, because the Department of State feels it would interfere with our relationship with these countries. And I suspect that this, too, would be one of the undermining factors to not just the Magnitsky proposal, but the others that we're talking about. But I think there's a lot to be done here in the United States, and maybe it's for an additional forum to this one, which could be done and done very productively. Thank you.
I'd just like to add that these people who are being barred are in a position. We have Perry. We have a question up here. I don't know. Do you have
Gentlemen,
this gentleman here has asked, and I promised that he would be able to ask a question. Go ahead. We only have about 5 minutes left, so let's keep it really concise, please. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Sean Waterman from the Washington Times. I'd just like to ask the panelists, perhaps somewhat off topic, to comment on what kind of cooperation the United States authorities might expect to receive from Russian law enforcement and security agencies as they go looking at the visit that the elder of the two brothers in the Boston bombing took to Dagestan last year, and you know, whether they can sort of cast any light just on that relationship and on how the Russian security agencies are likely to be thinking about you know, this event.
I have an answer.
Yes, Andrei.
I wrote this answer on internet half an hour before our panel. The Russian authority formally stated that have no official information and have no confirmation of any presence of Mr. Tamerlan, what is his family? Tsarnaev on Russian territory in 2012.
Even Mr. Tsarnaev just landed in Moscow in January and left Moscow in July, year 2012, spending on the territory of Russia 7 months. Okay, I would add to that that certainly you probably would not consider too serious, that just cooperation could be expected as probably as similar to what Soviet authorities could provide the US authorities help in the case of Lee Harvey Oswald in 1963.
It's cooperation between the FSB and American law enforcement is, I mean, it's not to say that it's impossible, but it's fraught with difficulty, and we cannot assume that the FSB will be cooperating with the United States in a manner of this kind with complete openness and good faith. Yes, please, you had a question. Yeah. And then we'll take a few more in that before we, but just a question, please.
Nasser Carter, Senior Fellow here at Hudson Institute. My question is about Russia's Middle East policy. Why Middle East policy? Why does Putin support a dead man walking, Bashar al-Assad? And will he do it to the end? Thanks.
Because he's thinking that he will be the next. Very simple. It's very personal.
Okay.
In Russian, as I already put it in Russia, in Kremlin perception, Arab Spring is conspiracy of United States directed against Russia. So first Mubarak, then Gaddafi, then Assad, and then Putin. I'm not joking. They seriously believe in it. So support of Assad is driven not some geopolitical consideration, just very personal, first of all, very personal sympathy, cooperative sympathy of dictators, and second, by the real concern for his own life. He several times, very frequently, he commented videotape of Gaddafi entry. What a horrible! It's really, really impressive.
It seemed to make an impression. All right, I think we have time for just a few more questions. If those who, and we have a couple of questions on Twitter, which I'll direct to the panelists. Are there any comments on the last news from Stratfor that U.S. and Russian presidents are ready to increase counterterrorism cooperation? How is the canceling of the 4th phase of the ballistic missile defense going to affect U.S.-Russian relations? Now, is there anyone else who has a question for the panelists? If not, we'll close with those questions that were submitted over Twitter. Andrei, do you want to?
Well, the second question, in no way, because as I explained, all these so-called Russian grievances are false grievances. If the United States accommodate one of these false grievances, they present two new. And the best illustration of Mr. Obama and Mr. Putin statement of cooperation is the official Russia information about Tamerlan Tsarnaev, which I just quoted.
Andrei, do you have anything to add to that? No? In that case, thanks to all of you for coming, and we'll, of course, you'll be free to ask me or the other panelists any questions that you might have afterwards. And we plan to continue these discussions at Hudson in the future. So thank you.